Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at 2 Kings chapter 13, where we read about, among other things, the death of Elisha. We've been looking at the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel, the kings of the southern kingdom of Judah. We went with Judah with Jehoram and Ahaziah and Athaliah, and finally Jehoash, also named Joash. And then at the end of his reign, remember, he was assassinated. We saw this last time. And then at the end of his reign, we have Amaziah. But now we're going to go back and look at the story in Israel as it's taking place. In Israel, we had Jehu that began that fourth dynasty by wiping out, killing everybody in the previous dynasty. And then once he dies, now we have Jehoahaz, his son, coming to the throne of the northern kingdom of Israel. 2 Kings chapter 13, verse 1, in the 23rd year of Joash, the son of Ahaziah, king of Judah, Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, became king over Israel at Samaria, and he reigned 17 years. He, that is the king of this northern kingdom of Israel, he did evil in the sight of the Lord and followed the sins of Jeroboam. Remember, that's the standard running commentary of all the kings of the northern kingdom. Yes, there were a couple of them that were worshipers of Baal, but all of them followed in the sins of Jeroboam, the sins of worshiping God in the wrong way, of using golden calves at Dan and Bethel to worship God. So he followed the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, with which he made Israel sin. He did not turn from them. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them continually into the hand of Hazael, king of Aram, and into the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael. So we're going to see several different kings of Aram. We're seeing several different kings of the northern kingdom of Israel and several different kings of the southern kingdom of Judah. And so Jehoahaz, notice he's under the thumb of Aram. Now, Aram had come down, we saw last time how Aram had come down and tried to invade Judah and had not been pushed out by force of arms, but rather was bought off. The king of Judah had just taken all the gold out of the temple and his own palace and just given everything to Aram, and they had turned around and gone home. Now the same sort of situation is coming against the northern kingdom of Israel, still Aram, and the Lord sends an unnamed deliverer. And throughout this, Israel continues to have a very small standing army. They're down to 50 horsemen and 10 chariots. And we read the reason for this lack of arms development is chapter 13, verse 7. For the king of Aram had destroyed them and had made them like dust at threshing. Just sort of going right through them and destroying their army and leaving them very little in the way of defense. Verse 9, and Jehoahaz slept with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria. And Joash, his son, became king in his place. In the 37th year of Joash, king of Judah, Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, became king over Israel and Samaria. Now, that's a little hard to follow. So we have Joash, and remember, the names Joash and Joash and Jehoash are basically the same name, two different ways of saying it. So this is Joash who becomes king of the northern kingdom. Notice his father is buried in Samaria in the 37th year of Joash, king of Judah. So somewhat confusing when you've got two different kings with the same name at the same time. At the same as he becomes king of Judah, the same Joash, but he's also called here Jehoash. The son of Jehoahaz, becomes king over Israel and Samaria and reigned 16 years. So notice we had Jehoash on the right, whose son would be Amaziah, but we're not really talking about him yet. And then Jehoash, the other Jehoash, also known as Joash. They both have the same, you can call either one Jehoash or Joash. He's now the third king of the fourth dynasty, the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, just to sort of rehash what we've done, I want you to see the pattern that has developed between these kings of Aram with its capital in Damascus and Israel and Judah. We had back in chapter 8, we had Hazael anointed the king of Aram, and he had begun this whole anointing process when his master Ben-Hadad, who had been the king, had been sick and ill and would eventually die from that, but not die because of just natural causes. He was probably on his way out with natural causes. And then Hazael sped up the process by assassinating him. We saw that in chapter 8, verses 7 through 15. And then the scene switched to Jehoram of Judah in the rest of chapter 8, where his chariots fight against Edom, but then lose the war. And then he goes through some military setbacks where Edom remains in revolt against Judah. Next, we have Ahaziah of Judah, the son of Jehoram, and we're introduced to his mother Athaliah, who was married to Jehoram, and remember, she's the Phoenician queen. And then Jehu's coup, uh, brings about the fall of the entire dynasty of the northern kingdom of Israel. And all of the sons of Ahab are put to the sword, and Jehu now makes himself the king. He's going to bring about the fourth dynasty of the northern kingdom of Israel. That was the turning point. Next, the scene shifts to Judah, where we see Joash of Judah after Athaliah's wicked rule, where she puts to death all of his brothers, but he escapes. And in chapters 11 and 12, remember that as a child, he's hidden in the temple, and then he is brought to light, and Athaliah is put to death, and then he rules. And at least in 2 Kings chapters 11 and 12, all the things that we're told about him there are good. Now, if we read Second Chronicles, we see some negative things, but we're not going to look at that right now because we're in the middle of 2 Kings. And so we had the reign of Joash of Judah. Again, notice the reference to his mother in both those cases. And next we have Jehoahaz of Israel. And just like Jehoram of Judah had this story about chariots and military defeats, with Jehoahaz of Israel, his chariots, we just saw, they're reduced to only 10 in number. And he goes through military defeats, not at the hands of Edom, but at the hands of Aram, much more stringent defeats. And finally, we come to the last section that rounds up this whole thing. Remember, we started with someone who's ill unto death, Ben-Hadad, and an anointing. And now we have Jehoash of Israel, who defeats Hazael of Aram. And this section begins with Elisha, who by now is aged, and he is now ill unto death. And he will die as well. Now, nobody's going to assassinate him, but he will die. So this section of the story opens up in verse 14. When Elisha became sick with illness, of which he was to die, Joash, king of Israel, came down to him and wept over him and said, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. Now, as we read that, we're not used to seeing the king of Israel speaking so kindly toward Elisha, because we're used to seeing people like Ahab and his sons who were always wanting to put Elisha to death or fight against him. But after Jehu had come and put that previous dynasty to death, and remember, it had been Jehu who had been anointed at the orders of Elisha. And so the fourth dynasty, even though they're not doing everything correct like they ought to, they're still friendly toward Elisha. And so this is why you have this response. My father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And what they're saying is, we don't have much in the way of chariots, but Elisha, your presence is able to keep us from harm. And your presence and the God of Israel can be the chariots of Israel and their horsemen, even if we don't have any ourselves. Now, if they would take that idea and run with it, then everything could be good, especially if they will obey the Lord with regard to his worship. And that they're still getting that wrong. Verse 15, Elisha said to him, take a bow and arrows. And so he took a bow and arrows, and he's going to act out something. Verse 16, then he said to the king of Israel, put your hand on the bow, and he put his hand on it. Then Elisha laid his hands on the king's hands. Notice, here's the king holding a bow, And then Elisha puts his hands on the king's hands that are holding the bow. And he said, open the window toward the east. And he opened it. Now, what's toward the east? Well, toward the east is, remember, Aram is technically toward the north, but they've invaded down to the east, that whole area on the east side of the Jordan, of the east side of the Jordan River. They've been taking. That's become the country of Aram. And he said, open the window toward the east. And he opened it. Then Elisha said, shoot. And he shot. And he said, the Lord's arrow of victory, even the arrow of victory over Aram, for you will defeat the Arameans at Aphek until you have destroyed them. But he's got to act that out. And here we're going to see that acted. Verse 18, then he said, take the arrows. And he took them. And he said to the king of Israel, strike the ground. And he struck it 3 times and stopped. So the man of God was angry with him, said, you should have struck 5 or 6 times. I told you to strike, not just once. I strike the ground, and there was that repeated idea. And yes, you hit it 3 times, but if you'd have just kept hitting it, then he said, then you would have struck Aram until you would have destroyed it. But now you shall strike Aram only 3 times. And so notice he was acting it out, and in his action, he didn't go far enough. And so Elisha rebukes him over that. He said, now it's good, you're going to have victory, but you could have had greater victory. It makes me wonder, what are things that we could do to have a greater victory in our own lives? Verse 20, Elisha died, and they buried him. Now the bands of the Moabites would invade the land in the spring of the year. Now this wasn't like big major armies. These are raiders. They're almost like an annoyance. Verse 21, and here they were being an annoyance. And as they were burying a man, behold, they saw a marauding band. And they cast the man into the grave of Elisha. And when the man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood up on his feet. It's like, whoa! Even in his death, Elisha brings about life. Even in his death? No, maybe especially in his death. And that is going to remind us of someone else who in his death brought about victory, especially in his death, brought about resurrection. And we'll see that in just a minute. But for right now, we continue. Chapter 13, verse 22. Now Hazael, king of Aram, had oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz, but the Lord was gracious to them and had compassion on them and turned to them. Why? I mean, they still hadn't gotten worship right, but he turned to them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not destroy them or cast them from his presence until now. Not that he's going to do it now, but even up to the present, even with all of their disobedience, he has been gracious. Why? Because of his covenant. God has been long-suffering. He'd made a covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And because of that, he had withheld that greater judgment upon Israel. Now, it's not going to be withheld forever. We're going to see that judgment come here in 2 Kings. But for the time, God is remembering his covenant. Verse 24, when Hazael, king of Aram, died, Ben-Hadad, his son, became king in his place. Notice Ben-Hadad seems to almost be a ceremonial title. Ben-Hadad means son of Hadad, and Hadad was one of their deities. Then Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, took again from the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, the cities which he had taken in war from the hand of Joahaz, his father. 3 times, remember 3 times he had struck the ground 3 times, and he had been promised, you're going to get victory 3 times. Well, sure enough, 3 times Joash defeated him and recovered the cities of Israel. And that was good. That was good. But the suggestion is that it could have been better. And so we have Elisha's prophecy over Israel's victory over Aram, and then Elisha dies, and we saw that very interesting resurrection that takes place where a dead man rises upon touching his bones, and then the prophecy of Israel's victory over Aram is fulfilled. And again, that reminds us of the greater story of the Bible, where throughout the Old Testament we've seen prophecies and the Old Covenant of God's relationship with Israel and promises about how God would do something great and yes, the country would be scattered and bad things would happen in judgment, but he would bring them back and he would give them not just a physical restoration, but a spiritual restoration. And that came to pass when the one greater than Elisha comes, the one who came from Nazareth, Jesus, comes and dies, and in his dying gives us new life, so that the promises, all those promises of the Old Testament, are fulfilled in Jesus. And we enter into those promises, even we Gentiles who have no right in our own selves to be part of that new covenant. Because remember, the new covenant was made with Judah and Israel. And yet, through faith, as we've trusted in the one who died in our place, he has joined us to himself. And because of that, we have become partakers of the new covenant. And we can come to that table and we can eat and we can drink the blood, that which represents the blood of the covenant. And so we have a contrast between Elisha and Jesus. Elisha, his name, God, you can go either God of salvation or my God saves. You can go either way. Uh, Jesus, notice it's not God. God is that word El or Elohim. Jesus, Yeshua, will save. Yahweh will save. That's what the name Yeshua means. Elisha, his ministry begins at the Jordan. When Elijah, his master, is taken to heaven, Jesus, his ministry begins with his baptism in the Jordan, when the one who comes in the spirit and power of Elijah baptizes him. In the case of Elisha, he raised the son of the Shunammite woman from the dead. In the case of Jesus, he raised the son of the widow of Nain from the dead. In the case of Elisha, he fed a crowd of men with barley loaves. In the case of Jesus, he fed 5,000 men with 5 loaves and 2 fish. In the case of Elisha, he provided oil to supernaturally multiply in the home of that widow. In the case of Jesus, he turned water into wine at a wedding. In the case of Elisha, he healed Naaman of his leprosy. Jesus healed a great number of lepers during his ministry. In the case of Elisha, he caused a lost axe head to float up to the surface of the Jordan. Jesus caused Peter to walk on water. Peter, who was sort of a lost axe and sinking, caused him to not only float, but actually walk on the water. Elisha had an unfaithful disciple in the person of Gehazi, and you remember what happened to him. And Jesus also had an unfaithful disciple in Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. In the case of Elisha, he caused the enemies of Israel to be blinded and then restored their sight. Jesus gave sight to the blind and spiritual sight to us as well. Elisha's tomb became a place of resurrection when a body was thrown into his tomb. And Jesus rose from the dead and became the promise of our resurrection, where one day, not only have we risen spiritually, but one day we will raise physically when he comes again.